In the late summer of 1895, the Georgia State Archives stood as a quiet keeper of the state's collective memory. The air inside was thick with the smell of aging paper, and dust floated lazily through the shafts of sunlight that cut through the high windows. It was there that Henry Vance, a clerk known for his careful habits and deep respect for the written word, found himself buried in the enormous task of reorganizing the state's oldest census documents. It was slow, often tedious work, but Vance treated it with the focus of an archaeologist sifting through ruins, convinced that every scrap of paper held some forgotten story. Then, while going through the brittle pages of the 1855 census for Muskogee County, his eye caught something that didn't make sense. There, written in the flowing script of the time, was a name, Samuel Rich. His age was listed as 7. Vance, being the type to double-check everything, pulled the 1860 census for the same county, a document he had recently catalogued. He searched for Samuel Rich. Nothing. He checked the 1870 census. Still nothing. At first, he thought it was probably just a small clerical mistake, maybe a child who had passed away or a family that had moved on. But something about this absence stuck with him. He started looking through birth records, church registries, and even property deeds connected to the Rich family. Piece by piece, what he uncovered wasn't a simple error, it was an impossibility. Every other official document, including the family's own Bible, showed that the youngest Rich son, Samuel, was born in 1860. He appeared in the 1860 census as a baby, and his age matched up naturally in later records. But here, in 1855, was a Samuel Rich, 7 years old, 5 years before the family's Samuel was even born. The discovery landed like a cold whisper in the quiet of the archives. This wasn't a ghost story in the usual sense, no apparitions or hauntings, but something far stranger, a crack in the official record itself. It pointed to something deliberate, a carefully built deception that had taken 40 years and the quiet diligence of a clerk to finally uncover. What kind of secret would push a family to invent a child in public records, only to erase him and then replace him with another 5 years later? That question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered, hinting at a story much darker than anything Vance had come across in all his years among dusty ledgers. Before we go further into the unsettling truth behind the Rich family's impossible child, if this glimpse into a forgotten past has caught your attention, please consider subscribing to the Fear Sermon. Your support helps us bring more of these chilling historical mysteries to light. And let us know in the comments, what forgotten corner of history do you think holds the most unsettling secrets? Muskogee County, Georgia, in the mid-1850s was still a place finding its footing. It sat at the crossroads where frontier ambition met the Old South's sense of gentility. The red clay earth, baked hard by summer heat and softened by winter rains, grew cotton and corn in abundance, fueling the wealth of those who owned the land. In the humid months, the air carried the heavy scent of magnolia and honeysuckle, mixed with the earthy smell of fresh soil and the distant sharpness of wood smoke. Life moved at a steady pace, ruled by the seasons and the demands of farm work. The Rich family had come from South Carolina in 1840 and quickly made a place for themselves in this growing society. Their plantation, Willow Creek, covered 200 acres, a solid holding that let Thomas Hartwell Rich grow both his crops and his standing in the community. Thomas, then in his mid-40s, was a man with a strong presence. Tall, with a stern face and sharp eyes, he had a near-obsessive need for control. His ledgers were flawless, every bushel of cotton, every head of livestock, every penny accounted for. He served on the county commission, attended First Baptist Church without fail, and was known for his strict sense of propriety. To anyone looking in, Thomas Rich was the picture of a respectable Southern gentleman. His wife, Margaret, was 20 years younger and came from a prominent Charleston family. Their marriage was more about combining wealth and status than love. Margaret had a delicate nature and was prone to nervous ailments, but she carried herself with the quiet dignity expected of a plantation mistress. She ran the household with care, managed the enslaved domestic staff, and found her only real comfort in a small rose garden she tended herself. Together, they had 3 children who were considered healthy and well-adjusted. William, born in 1842, was a strong boy meant to inherit the land. Catherine, born in 1845, was lively and sharp-witted. James, born in 1848, was quieter and more studious. Their births were recorded in the family Bible, their baptisms noted in the church registry, and their names carefully entered in the 1850 federal census. They were the visible proof of a proper family, their existence reflecting the rich family's prosperity and commitment to social expectations. The plantation itself was a small world. The main house stood 2 stories tall with a wide veranda, shaded by ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss. Beyond the tidy lawns stretched the cotton fields to the horizon, and farther off were the cabins where the enslaved population lived. The sounds of Willow Creek were constant, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the steady thud of hoes in the fields, the lowing of cattle, and the quiet voices of enslaved people moving through their daily tasks. The smells were just as familiar: wood smoke from the kitchen, the sweet decay of ripe fruit, the sharp scent of pine, and in summer, the heavy perfume of jasmine. In this carefully ordered world, anything unexpected was a threat, and stepping outside the norm was unthinkable. Thomas Rich understood that respectability wasn't something you were born with, it was a performance, carefully staged and maintained. Any crack in the surface could undo years of effort. It was this deep awareness of social vulnerability that would lead Thomas to make a decision that would mark his family for generations and leave a strange, impossible mark on the historical record. In the late fall of 1854, Margaret Rich announced she was expecting their 4th child. The news was met with the usual quiet satisfaction: another heir, another sign of the family's strength. But this pregnancy was different from the start. Margaret was hit with a lingering sickness that went well beyond the usual first few months. Her already delicate health seemed to give way under the strain. She spent long days in bed, the curtains drawn against the Georgia sun, her appetite fading and her spirit sinking. The family doctor, Elias Thorne, whose medical knowledge mixed folk remedies with basic science, could only offer tonics and vague reassurances that some women just had a harder time. As months passed, Margaret's condition worsened. She had persistent fevers, tremors, and restless sleep filled with disturbing dreams. The enslaved women who cared for her, especially an older woman named Hattie whose hands were worn from years of labor but whose touch was soft, spoke quietly among themselves. They talked of bad humors and unlucky signs, a sharp contrast to the doctor's more hopeful but empty words. The air in Margaret's sickroom grew thick with the smell of camphor and lavender, a weak attempt to mask the deeper unease. The birth, when it finally came in the spring of 1855, was long and brutal. It stretched over 2 days and a night, leaving Margaret weak and confused, her screams faintly echoing through the thick walls of the plantation house. Thomas Rich, normally a man of steady composure, paced the veranda with a grim look on his face. The sounds from inside tested the control he worked so hard to keep. He had expected another healthy child, another perfect addition to his line. What he got instead was a shock. The baby, a boy, was alive but deeply malformed. The exact nature of his condition was never written down in any surviving document, a sign of how quickly and completely his existence was suppressed. But the family's actions made the truth clear. His limbs were twisted at odd angles, his small body bent out of shape, and his features, though human, were distorted in ways that were hard to describe. He didn't cry with the strong, healthy sound of a typical newborn. Instead, he made a thin, weak noise, more like a whimper. Dr. Thorne, with a look of pity and helplessness, quietly told Thomas the news. He spoke in vague terms about a child of mysterious design, about a burden to be carried. But Thomas understood what wasn't being said. This child was a flaw, a visible crack in the careful image of his family. The shame would be overwhelming, the whispers relentless. In the strict social order of the antebellum South, a visibly disabled child in a prominent family wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a public embarrassment. It could hurt his other children's chances of marriage, the family's standing, even the value of their property. Standing in the dim birthing room, the child's faint cries echoing in his ears, Thomas Rich made a choice. It was a decision driven by fear, pride, and a cold, practical assessment of what it would take to protect his family's position. This child, he decided, would not exist, at least not in any official sense. Not in any record that could be checked, not in any way that could bring shame to the Rich name or invite the questions of neighbors and relatives. The baby was born, but his existence would be a secret, carefully guarded and erased from public view. The infant was given a name, Samuel, a quiet acknowledgement from Margaret while she was still in a daze, a name that would later become part of an elaborate deception. He was baptized in secret, a quiet ceremony performed by a minister who was either sympathetic or too intimidated to ask questions. Reverend Elijah Stone, the minister, knew how power worked in a plantation community and understood the unspoken requests of men like Thomas Rich. He did what was asked, offered a short, solemn prayer, and left, taking the secret with him. The real Samuel Rich, the child of flesh and blood, never appeared in any census, never showed up in a birth registry, never was acknowledged by his father in any public way. His existence was a void, a carefully managed absence. Instead, Thomas Rich set in motion a remarkable act of deception. The 1855 federal census was set to be taken that summer. The man assigned to count Muskogee County was Josiah Crane, a distant cousin of the Rich family, better known for his easygoing nature than for attention to detail. Crane often visited Willow Creek, sitting on the veranda with Thomas, talking about crops and local politics. He knew his place and understood the unspoken rules of deference to men of higher standing. When Josiah Crane arrived at Willow Creek in late July 1855, his ledger and quill in hand under the harsh Georgia sun, Thomas Rich greeted him with his usual, though somewhat strained, politeness. They sat in the cool shade of the veranda, sipping lemonade, while Crane wrote down the household details. Thomas listed his wife Margaret and their 3 older children, giving their ages precisely. Then, with a casualness that hid the enormity of what he was about to do, Thomas added another name, Samuel Rich, age 7. Josiah Crane, maybe distracted by the heat or the easy conversation, or just accustomed to trusting Thomas Rich, didn't question it. He wrote down what he was told, his quill scratching across the page. And just like that, the phantom Samuel Rich, a child who existed only on paper, was born into the official record, listed as 7 years old, 5 years before the real Samuel Rich ever took a breath. The boldness of the lie was stunning, and its execution was chillingly simple. Creating this imaginary child served a few purposes. It let Thomas Rich keep up the appearance of a complete, healthy family in the official record, heading off any questions about a missing child. It also created a convenient fiction, a placeholder for the child Thomas felt should have been healthy and whole. The phantom Samuel grew older on paper, a silent reminder of a life that never was, while the real Samuel grew in secret, hidden away, his existence a carefully guarded secret. The weight of maintaining this fiction must have been crushing, especially for Margaret. She was already fragile, and living with the constant presence of her hidden, deformed child, while publicly lying about it, must have worn on her. She rarely spoke of Samuel, even to Hattie, the enslaved woman who mainly cared for him. Her days took on a quiet sadness, her nights often restless. The scent of her rose garden, once a comfort, now seemed to mock her with its perfect beauty, a painful contrast to the imperfection she carried in her own home. For 5 years, the deception held. The phantom Samuel Rich aged in the records, a ghost within the machinery of bureaucracy, while the real Samuel grew in secret, tucked away in a small, windowless room in the back of the plantation house. He was looked after by enslaved women, mostly Hattie and her daughter Clara, who were bound by fear and circumstance to keep the secret. Their lives, already shaped by the harsh realities of slavery, now carried the added weight of this unspoken trust. They moved through the house quietly, their faces showing nothing of the hidden life they tended. Then, in 1860, the census came around again. Thomas Rich had a choice. The phantom Samuel would now be 12. The real Samuel was 5. To keep up the act, Thomas would have had to keep the fiction going forever, making the imaginary child older year after year, building a web of lies that would get harder to maintain. Or he could just let the phantom disappear from the records, remove him from the 1860 census, and start a new story. He chose the latter. When the census taker came to Willow Creek in 1860, Thomas listed his family as before: Margaret, William, Catherine, and James. But Samuel Rich, the phantom child, was gone. He vanished from the official records as strangely as he had appeared in 1855. The real Samuel stayed hidden, but now he was truly invisible, not even a phantom on paper, just an absence, a void where a person should have been. The lie had done its job, and now it was thrown aside, leaving behind only the faintest ripple in the vast sea of historical data. The secret might have died with Thomas Rich, who passed away in 1878, his face still stern, his ledgers still perfect, if not for the chance reorganization of documents in 1895 and the curiosity of a clerk named Henry Vance, who noticed something that no one else had ever thought to look for, a child who appeared in the records before he was born. The story of Samuel Rich, the phantom child, is a chilling example of how far some will go to protect appearances. It makes you wonder what other truths might be buried beneath the surface of official history. If you find yourself drawn to these hidden narratives, these whispers from the past, consider joining our community. Subscribe to the Fear Sermon, and let's keep exploring the darker corners of history together. The room where Samuel Rich spent his hidden life wasn't a dungeon or a cell meant for punishment. It was a small, windowless chamber in the farthest, least used wing of the Willow Creek plantation house. It had once been a storage room, maybe for linens or old clothes, but Thomas Rich had repurposed it with a cold kind of efficiency. The single narrow window that looked out toward the woods at the edge of the property had been boarded up from the inside, thick pine planks nailed tight, sealing out the light and the world. The air inside was always stale, heavy with the smell of old wood, dust, and the faint trace of human confinement. The room was sparely furnished, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, a chamber pot, and a small, roughly made table holding a single candle that burned day and night. Its flickering flame was the only light in the constant gloom. The walls, once plastered and painted a pale cream, were now stained by time and damp, marked with dark streaks that looked like weeping shadows. The only sounds that made it through the thick walls were the distant, muffled echoes of plantation life, a rooster crowing, a dog barking, the faint hum of voices, sounds that must have seemed impossibly far away, like echoes from another world. Samuel's days were a dull cycle of feeding, cleaning, and quiet endurance. He was given a simple diet of gruel and broth, brought by Hattie or Clara, their faces showing nothing, their movements quick and functional. They spoke to him in low tones, if at all, their words few and to the point. There was no warmth, no comfort, no gentle touch beyond what was necessary. They were caregivers, yes, but also silent keepers, bound by the unspoken thread of Thomas Rich's anger. The feel of his world was rough cotton, cold ceramic, and the hard surface of the wooden floor. The temperature swung from suffocating in summer to bone-chilling in winter, with no escape from the elements. As Samuel grew from an infant to a child, his deformities became more pronounced, his movements more jerky and uncontrolled. He never learned to speak, communicating instead with guttural sounds and the desperate movement of his twisted limbs. He was a prisoner in his own body and a prisoner in that small, dark room. The only comfort, if you could call it that, was the wall. With something, no one knew for sure what, maybe a loose nail, a piece of pottery, or even his own fingernails, Samuel started making marks, hundreds of them, thin, uneven scratches in the plaster, a desperate attempt to mark the passage of time, to leave some sign of his existence. They weren't organized, not a calendar, but a chaotic mix of lines, each one a silent cry against the emptiness of his life. There were also rough drawings scratched into the plaster, maybe with a piece of charcoal or a stone. They showed a figure, clearly human but with limbs bent at odd angles, a twisted reflection of his own body. These weren't the playful scribbles of a child exploring his world. They were the desperate self-portrait of a person trying to understand his own broken form, to make sense of his existence in a world that refused to see him. Thomas Rich visited his hidden son sometimes, maybe once a month or less. These weren't fatherly visits. They were inspections. He would stand in the doorway, his face blank, watching the child with a distant, almost clinical look. He would ask about Samuel's health, his needs, but never with warmth. The visits were short, practical, a man checking on a broken piece of equipment he had chosen to keep rather than throw away. Margaret, worn down by her own fragile health and the crushing weight of the secret, rarely came into the room. The other children, William, Catherine, and James, knew there was a sick child kept in the back, a hushed secret that seemed to hang in the air of the house. But they were never allowed to see him, never allowed to talk about him. The silence around Samuel was complete, a suffocating blanket made of fear and shame. The slow, painful passage of time for Samuel was marked only by the changing light that slipped through the cracks in the boarded window, the small shifts in temperature, and the growing number of scratches on the wall. He was a ghost in his own home, a living example of a father's cold pragmatism and a society's unforgiving judgment. The year 1895, when Henry Vance made his unsettling discovery, was a time of deep change in Georgia. The scars of the Civil War, which had ended 30 years before, were still visible in the land and in the people. The old plantation economy had fallen apart, replaced by a mix of tenant farming and slow industrialization. The grand houses, once symbols of wealth and power, often stood in varying states of decay, their paint peeling, their frames groaning under the weight of memory and neglect. Henry Vance, a man shaped by the careful order of ledgers and archives, found himself pulled deeper into the mystery of Samuel Rich. What started as professional curiosity had grown into a quiet obsession. The discrepancy was too clear, too deliberate to be a simple mistake. He spent his evenings going over old maps of Muskogee County, cross-referencing names, looking for any mention of Samuel Rich in local newspapers or church bulletins. The more he searched, the louder the silence became. The archive itself seemed to add to the mystery. The huge, echoing halls lined with shelves of forgotten lives felt like a museum of untold stories. The dry smell of paper, the soft rustle of pages, the distant clatter of a typewriter from another office, these were Vance's only companions as his sense grew that he had found something deeply unsettling. He pictured the census taker, Josiah Crane, sitting on the veranda of Willow Creek, the heavy Georgia air around him, his quill moving, unknowingly writing a lie into the official history of the state. The thought gave Vance a chill, even in the summer heat. Vance's first attempts to find a logical answer came to nothing. He checked death records for Muskogee County for any Samuel Rich born around 1848 who might have died before 1860. Nothing. He looked for records of families named Rich moving out of the county. None matched. He even thought about the chance that the child had been sent to an asylum or institution. But such places were rare in Georgia in the 1850s, and their records, where they existed, were equally silent about a Samuel Rich. The more he dug, the clearer it became that this was no accident. This was deliberate. The realization crept up on him slowly. Someone, a person with influence and resources, had intentionally falsified a government document. But for what purpose? The answer, Vance suspected, wasn't something simple like avoiding taxes or hiding a small offense. It was something much more personal, much more desperate. The phantom Samuel Rich was a sign of a deeper, darker secret, a carefully built illusion meant to protect something precious or hide something shameful. Vance knew, with a certainty that went beyond professional duty, that he had to go to Muskogee County. He had to speak to the Rich family, or what was left of it. The truth, he felt, was waiting there, buried under decades of silence and red Georgia clay. The trip from Atlanta to Muskogee County in the fall of 1895 was a slow, rattling train ride. The landscape outside the window was a mix of change and decay. The cotton fields, once vast and carefully tended, now showed signs of neglect, broken up by patches of scrub pine and unused land. The grand plantations, many of them, were either crumbling ruins or had been split into smaller farms worked by tenants or sharecroppers. The air, crisp with the approach of winter, carried the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Vance arrived in Muskogee County with a sense of unease. He was a man used to paper and ink, not confrontation, but the mystery of Samuel Rich had taken hold of his mind, demanding answers. He carried copies of the census documents, the sharp contrast between the 1855 and 1860 entry sitting like a silent accusation. His first stop was the county courthouse, where he hoped to find more local records, maybe a will or a property transfer that might shed light on the Rich family's affairs. He found little new, but the courthouse clerk, an older man named Mr. Abernathy, remembered the Rich family. Thomas Rich, he mused. A stern man. Kept to himself mostly after the war. His son William runs the place now, what's left of it. With directions in hand, Vance hired a buggy and driver to take him to Willow Creek. The road, once well kept, was now rutted and overgrown, the ride slow and bumpy. The plantation house, when it finally came into view from behind a stand of old oaks, was a shadow of what it had once been. The paint was peeling, the veranda sagged, and the once manicured lawns were now a tangle of weeds and wild grass. The air around the house felt heavy, weighted with unspoken history. William Rich, now in his early 50s, met Vance on the decaying veranda. He was a man whose shoulders seemed permanently bent, his face marked by years of struggle. The war had taken his inheritance, his labor force, and the very foundation of his world. He offered Vance a glass of lukewarm water, his hospitality a thin cover over a deep, tired resignation. The parlor where they sat was faded and dusty, the once bright wallpaper now peeling, the heavy velvet curtains moth-eaten. The silence in the room was deep, broken only by the distant caw of a crow and the creak of the old house settling. Vance, choosing his words carefully, explained why he had come. He laid out the census documents, pointing to the entry for Samuel Rich in 1855, then to its absence in 1860. He talked about discrepancies, about the need for accuracy in the state's records, about his professional duty. He didn't accuse. He just asked. "Mr. Rich," Vance began, his voice soft but steady, "can you explain this? Could it have been a clerical error? Did the boy perhaps die or move away without being recorded?" William Rich's reaction was immediate and raw. His already pale face went white, his eyes, usually dull with fatigue, now showed a flash of something close to panic. He stared at the documents, then at Vance, his lips pressed into a tight line. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, its steady beat a sharp contrast to the sudden tension in the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, but Vance could hear the strain underneath, anger, shame, fear, all held in check. "That is a matter, sir, that does not concern you," William said, his eyes fixed on Vance. "It is a family matter, and it has been closed for 40 years. It is not your place to look into it." Vance pressed gently, explaining that as a state official he was only trying to clarify the historical record. He meant no offense, only accuracy. "Mr. Rich, the state archives aim for completeness. This discrepancy leaves a gap in our understanding of this county's history." William Rich stood up, signaling the conversation was over. "My father," he said, his voice taking on a brittle edge, "was a man of principle. He kept his affairs in order. If there's a problem with the census, it's not my family's fault. It's the fault of the census taker or the clerks who handled the documents later. I will not discuss this further." He turned to leave the room, his back stiff with unspoken resistance. But as Vance started gathering his papers, William paused at the doorway. The anger seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a deep weariness, a look of almost desperate resignation. He turned back, meeting Vance's eyes, and in that look, Vance saw a lifetime of burden. "There was a child," William said, his voice barely a whisper, the words seeming to force their way out. "A child born to my mother in 1855. The child was not well. My father made a decision about how the child would be recorded. That is all I will say. The matter is closed, and it has been closed for 40 years. I ask that you leave it closed." He turned and walked away, leaving Vance alone in the dusty parlor, the silence now heavy with the weight of a half-confession. Vance asked what had happened to the child, but William just shook his head, his shoulders slumped, and disappeared down the hall. The conversation was over. Vance left Willow Creek with more questions than answers, but he had gotten something important, confirmation. The phantom child was real. He had been born, and his existence was so unacceptable, so shameful, that the family had worked to hide him from the world. The question now wasn't whether Samuel Rich existed, but what had happened to him, and why his father had chosen such an elaborate lie. Over the next several months, Vance began a slow, careful investigation, a quiet search for truth in a community that preferred its secrets stay buried. He knew direct questions wouldn't get him far. Instead, he took a more roundabout approach, having casual conversations with the oldest residents of Muskogee County, people whose memories reached back to the years before the war. He spent time at the general store, the church, the local tavern, picking up bits of gossip, piecing together fragments of information like a mosaic. He spoke to older formerly enslaved people who had worked on the Rich plantation, now living in small, scattered communities, their voices soft with age and the weight of their own histories. One of them was Hattie, now well into her 80s, her skin like old paper, her eyes clouded but her mind still sharp. Vance found her in a small cabin on the edge of the county, spending her days in a small garden. He approached her with respect, talking not about census records but about the old days at Willow Creek, about Mrs. Rich, about the children. After some gentle conversation and a cup of sweet tea, Hattie finally spoke about the child. Her voice was a low, raspy whisper, as if the words themselves were painful. She confirmed that Margaret Rich had given birth to a boy in 1855, a child who wasn't right. She described his twisted limbs, his inability to speak, his constant soft whimpering. He was a child of sorrow, she murmured, her gaze distant. Master Thomas, he couldn't stand it. Said it was a curse. Said he wouldn't have no such thing in his house, not for the world to see. She talked about the child being kept in a back room, about her and Clara being given the job of caring for him. She spoke of the silence around him, the unspoken rules, the fear of Master Thomas's temper. She didn't describe the deformities in detail, but her tone carried a deep sense of pity and horror. Vance also tracked down Joseph Caldwell, a man in his late 70s who had been a neighboring planter in the 1850s. Caldwell, a talkative man with a loud laugh, remembered Thomas Rich well. Thomas was a proud man, Mr. Vance, Caldwell said, puffing on his pipe. Obsessed with appearances. Everything had to be just so. His crops, his family, his reputation. The idea of anything less than perfection, well, it would have driven him to distraction. Caldwell remembered vague whispers about a sickly child at Willow Creek, but nothing solid. Thomas kept his secrets close, tighter than a drum. His words painted a picture of a man so driven by social standing that he would go to great lengths to protect it. The most unsettling confirmation came from Reverend Elijah Stone, now a frail older man living in a small parsonage. Vance found him sitting by a window reading his Bible, his hands trembling slightly. When Vance carefully brought up the subject of a secret baptism at Willow Creek in 1855, Reverend Stone's eyes, though dim with age, widened a little. He hesitated, his gaze falling on the worn pages of his Bible. "A man's confidences," he began, his voice raspy, "are sacred, Mr. Vance. Especially those given in the shadow of God." But Vance, sensing the man's internal struggle, gently pressed, talking about the importance of truth, of the historical record. Finally, Reverend Stone gave in. He confirmed that Thomas Rich had called him to Willow Creek in the spring of 1855, asking for a private baptism for a baby boy named Samuel. He was a difficult child, the Reverend admitted, his voice barely audible. Master Rich insisted on complete secrecy. Said the child was too frail for a public ceremony, that the Lord's mercy was best sought in private. The Reverend's discomfort was clear, even after 40 years. He had performed the rite, offered a prayer for the child's soul, and never spoke of it again, not even to his wife. He had been troubled by the request, by the secrecy, but had felt powerless to refuse a man like Thomas Rich. Vance also ran into false leads and misdirection. Some older residents suggested Samuel might have been sent to relatives in another state, which was common for families with children seen as unfortunate or hard to manage. Others whispered that the child had simply died as an infant, which happened often in those days, and that Thomas, in his grief, had just forgotten to record the death. Vance followed each lead carefully, checking records in nearby counties, writing letters to far-off institutions, only to hit dead ends. Each empty trail only made him more certain that the truth was something more deliberate, more unsettling. The child hadn't just vanished. He had been made to vanish. The pieces were slowly coming together, a deformed child, a proud father, a secret baptism, a phantom entry in the census, and a life lived in total darkness. But the final fate of Samuel Rich, the child of sorrow, remained a mystery. If you're finding yourself drawn into this historical mystery and appreciate the detailed research that goes into bringing these forgotten stories to light, please consider supporting the Fear Sermon. Hit the like button, share this video, and let us know in the comments if you believe Samuel Rich ever truly escaped his hidden prison. Your engagement helps us continue our journey into the shadows of the past. In the winter of 1896, more than a year after his first discovery, Henry Vance returned to Muskogee County. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. His earlier visits had given him key testimony, but he still lacked the physical proof of Samuel's hidden existence. He had formed a theory, a chilling guess, if the child had been kept hidden on the plantation, there had to be some physical evidence, some change to the building, some trace of his confinement. He approached William Rich again, this time with a different angle. Instead of bringing up the census records, Vance introduced himself as a state archivist doing a historical survey of antebellum architecture, especially interested in the building methods of old plantation homes. He asked to look around Willow Creek, saying it was a good example of its kind. William, though still wary, wasn't as openly hostile. The idea that his family's decaying home might be seen as historically important seemed to appeal to a lingering sense of pride. After some back and forth and Vance's promise not to disturb anything or make any public statements without permission, William reluctantly agreed. The old house in the stark winter light looked even more worn down. The wind whistled through loose window panes, and the floorboards groaned with every step. Vance moved through the rooms with quiet intensity, his eyes taking in every detail, the thickness of the walls, the placement of windows, the flow of the layout. He paid special attention to the back wing, the area Hattie had mentioned, the part of the house that felt the coldest and most neglected. The air there was heavy, stale, carrying a faint, hard-to-place smell that hinted at years of disuse. It was in that back wing, tucked behind the main kitchen and a rarely used pantry, that Vance found what he was looking for. There was a section of wall that seemed subtly out of place. The plaster was newer, a slightly different shade, and the texture was uneven, as if it had been applied in a hurry. It was too thick, too solid for just a partition. He tapped it gently, and the sound was dull, not the hollow echo of a normal wall. He noticed faint, almost invisible lines in the plaster, running vertical and horizontal, suggesting a hidden seam. He turned to William Rich, who had been following him with a mix of suspicion and tired curiosity. "Mr. Rich," Vance said, keeping his voice low. "This section of wall seems to hide an opening. A doorway, maybe." William's already pale face turned ashen. His eyes went to the wall, then back to Vance, a flash of real fear in them. He stiffened, his jaw tightening. "That room is not to be opened," William said, his voice tight with emotion. "My father sealed it, and I have kept it sealed. What happened there is not your concern, nor the state's." But Vance had seen enough. The room was real. It existed, and it had been deliberately hidden, just as Samuel Rich had been hidden. The physical proof of the secret was right there. He explained calmly but firmly that as a state official looking into a historical oddity, he had a duty to understand the full context. He appealed to William's sense of family honor, suggesting that only by bringing the truth to light could the past finally be put to rest. After a long, tense silence, William Rich, his shoulders sagging in defeat, finally nodded. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. With William's reluctant permission, Vance carefully began to remove the plaster. It was slow, painstaking work, each piece of plaster revealing more of the hidden truth. Under the plaster, he found thick wooden planks nailed solidly across what had once been a doorway. The nails were old, rusted, driven deep into the frame. It was a deliberate, forceful act of sealing. As the last plank was pried away, revealing the dark opening of the doorway, a wave of stale, heavy air rolled out, thick with the smell of decay and long, stagnant confinement. Vance stepped inside, holding up a lantern. The weak, flickering light fought against the deep gloom. The room was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, its single narrow window still boarded up from the inside, letting in only thin slivers of weak light. The air was cold, damp, and utterly still. What he found inside was heartbreaking in its simplicity and its deep desolation. A narrow cot, its mattress rotted and stained, stood against one wall. A rusted chamber pot lay overturned in a corner. A small, roughly made table, its surface scarred and warped, held the remains of an ancient melted candle. But it was the walls that truly drew Vance's attention. They were covered from floor to ceiling with marks. Hundreds, maybe thousands of thin, uneven scratches in the plaster, made with something sharp and driven by desperate effort. They weren't organized, not a calendar, but a chaotic, desperate record of time passing, a silent scream against the emptiness of confinement. And among the scratches were rough but clear drawings, figures, human-like but twisted, their limbs bent at strange angles, their heads too large. They were the kind of drawings a severely disabled child might make, trying to understand his own body, trying to make sense of his existence in a world that had denied it. They were self-portraits of suffering, made in the dark by a hand that could barely hold a tool. William Rich stood in the doorway, his face gray, his eyes fixed on the marks on the wall. He said nothing. His silence was a deep testament to the horror he had lived with for so long. When Vance finally turned to him and asked, his voice hushed, "What happened to Samuel, Mr. Rich?" William just shook his head, a single sound escaping his throat, and turned away, unable to put into words the full weight of the truth. The sealed room, the physical proof of Samuel Rich's existence, stood as a silent, eloquent witness to a life lived and lost in darkness. It took several more visits, several more hushed conversations, and the slow, painful breaking down of William Rich's defenses before Henry Vance was able to piece together the full, tragic story of Samuel Rich. The truth, when it finally came out, was both simpler and more terrible than Vance had imagined, a story of human cruelty born of fear and pride. Samuel Rich had indeed been born in the spring of 1855 to Margaret Rich. The child came into the world with severe physical deformities. His limbs were twisted, his body contorted, and he was unable to speak or move on his own. The exact cause was never known, but the deformities were so severe that Thomas Rich, the moment he saw his son, made a cold, immediate decision: the child would not be recognized as his own. There had been whispers, Vance learned from Hattie and Clara, that Samuel's deformities were so extreme, so unlike a healthy child, that some on the plantation wondered if he was even Thomas Rich's son. Maybe he was the result of a secret affair, or even a curse. Whether true or not, such rumors would have only pushed Thomas to hide the child more desperately. A child born to an enslaved woman, especially one with such severe deformities, would have been a massive scandal, exposing Thomas's hypocrisy and possibly causing legal issues about the child's status. But even if Samuel was Margaret's biological son, his visible imperfection was a stain Thomas could not accept. Either way, the child's existence was a problem Thomas could not tolerate. So he created the phantom child in the census records, a way to acknowledge that a child named Samuel existed without admitting that the real Samuel, the deformed child hidden in the back room, was his son. The phantom Samuel grew older on paper, a ghost in the machinery of bureaucracy, while the real Samuel stayed frozen in time, hidden away, cared for by enslaved women bound by fear to keep the secret. For 5 years, Samuel lived in that small, dark room. He was fed. He was given water. He was kept alive. But he was never taken outside. He never saw sunlight except through the cracks in the boarded window. He was never spoken to, never touched with affection, never acknowledged as a person. He was a problem Thomas Rich had solved by making him disappear, and the solution had worked perfectly. The marks on the wall, William finally admitted, were Samuel's desperate attempts to mark the passage of time, a silent record of his agonizing confinement. Then, in 1860, the census came around again, and Thomas Rich had a choice. He could keep the fiction going, aging the phantom Samuel year after year, or he could let the phantom child disappear from the records. He chose to let him disappear. The phantom Samuel vanished from the 1860 census, and the real Samuel became truly invisible, not even a phantom on paper, just a complete absence. But what happened to the real Samuel after 1860? That was the question Vance could never fully answer, though he had his suspicions. According to Hattie and Clara, the child died sometime in the early 1860s, probably around 1862 or 1863. The cause of death wasn't recorded, but the women suggested that Samuel had simply wasted away, that his body, already twisted and broken, had just given up. The constant confinement, the lack of stimulation, the total neglect of his emotional and physical needs had worn him down. His death was never officially recorded. There was no funeral, no grave marker, no acknowledgement. The body was buried somewhere on the plantation in an unmarked grave, a final act of erasure, and the secret was kept. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the plantation was in chaos. Enslaved people were leaving. The economy was collapsing, and the old order was crumbling. In the middle of all that upheaval, the room where Samuel had been kept was sealed up, the door nailed shut, the wall plastered over. It was as if Thomas Rich, in his last years, had decided that the evidence of his crime, for it was a crime, though no law had been broken, should be erased from the world. The sealed room became a tomb for a memory, a physical reminder of the family's shared guilt. The story of Samuel Rich, the child who appeared in records before he was born, is a chilling example of the power of secrets and the lengths people will go to protect appearances. It's a story woven from fear, shame, and a deep, almost unimaginable cruelty. As Vance put together his findings, he began to see something beyond just the facts of Samuel's life and death. He began to understand the hidden psychology of secrecy, how a lie, once told, becomes a burden that grows heavier with each passing year, poisoning everything it touches. The phantom Samuel Rich had existed in the census records for 5 years. A ghost child who grew older on paper while the real child stayed hidden. And for 40 years after that, the secret was kept, passed down through the family, a weight each generation had to carry. William Rich, Thomas's oldest son, grew up knowing that his youngest brother existed but didn't exist. That there was a child in the house who wasn't supposed to be there, who wasn't supposed to be acknowledged, who wasn't supposed to matter. That knowledge shaped William's whole life. It made him complicit in his father's act, even though he had been a child when Samuel was hidden. It gave him a secret he could never share, a shame he could never escape. His bowed shoulders, his tired eyes, his deep resignation, all of it came from that lifelong burden. When Vance asked William why he had kept the room sealed after his father's death, why he hadn't destroyed the evidence or at least opened the room to air it out, William's answer was telling. Because, William said, his gaze on the distant horizon, as long as the room was sealed, I could pretend it never happened. As long as no one knew, the shame could stay contained. The moment I opened that door, the moment I let the world see what my father had done, the moment I acknowledged that my brother had existed and had suffered, I would have to accept my own part in it. I would have to accept that I had known and had done nothing. That was the real horror of Samuel Rich's story, Vance realized. It wasn't just the physical suffering of a child hidden in a dark room. It was the psychological damage to an entire family, bound together by a secret they could never talk about, never acknowledge, never move past. It was how one act of cruelty could echo through generations, leaving a legacy of guilt and unspoken sorrow. Vance started to wonder if there were other Samuels out there, other hidden children, other families who had made the same choice Thomas Rich made. How many children had been hidden away, erased from the records, made to disappear? How many families had carried the weight of such secrets, their lives shaped by the need to keep up a perfect front? The thought was chilling, suggesting a hidden history of suffering and denial beneath the calm surface of the past. By the spring of 1897, Vance had gathered everything he could find. He had talked to everyone still alive who was willing to speak. He had examined every available document. He had explored the plantation house and found the sealed room where Samuel had been kept. He had pieced together a story that, while not complete, was clear and compelling, a tapestry made from whispers, half-truths, and the stark evidence of that sealed room. He wrote up a report for the state archives, laying out his findings and his conclusions. The report was careful, measured, sticking to the facts without exaggeration. It didn't accuse Thomas Rich of any crime. There was no crime, legally, in keeping a child hidden on your own property. It didn't condemn the family. They were products of their time, working within a system that valued image over truth, respectability over compassion. But the report raised serious questions. It suggested that census records weren't always reliable, that they could be manipulated, that they didn't always reflect what was really happening in a community. It suggested there were hidden stories in the archives, stories deliberately covered up, stories that needed careful digging to uncover. The report was filed away in the state archives, where it went mostly unnoticed for many years. Most people who read it dismissed it as the work of a clerk with too much time on his hands. Some people in Muskogee County were offended, seeing it as an attack on the Rich family and on the county's honor. The Rich family itself made no public comment, though William reportedly said privately that Vance had no right to dig up the past. But Vance had done something important. He had brought Samuel Rich back into existence. The child who had been erased from the records, hidden away and forgotten, was now documented, now acknowledged, now part of the historical record. The phantom child who had appeared in the census before he was born had been explained, and in being explained, had been given a kind of dignity he never had in life. The legacy of Samuel Rich, the child who existed only in shadows and on a single strange census record, lingered in Muskogee County like a persistent, unsettling echo. In the years after Vance's investigation, the story started to spread, passed along in hushed whispers and scattered rumors, growing and changing with each telling. Some people, unable to accept the cruelty of the truth, made up gentler versions. They said Samuel hadn't died but had been sent to an institution in the north, where he lived out his life in obscurity. Others, looking for a more dramatic ending, claimed he had been killed, that Thomas, in a moment of despair, had smothered him to end his suffering. Still others, especially among the younger generation, spoke of Samuel's ghost haunting the old plantation, claiming to hear strange whimpers from the sealed room or seeing the marks on the walls appear and disappear mysteriously. None of these stories were true, or at least there was no evidence for them. But they spoke to a deep human need, to make sense of tragedy, to find meaning in suffering, to turn a private shame into a public story that could be understood and talked about, even if imperfectly. The community, in its own way, was trying to come to terms with the unsettling truth that had been uncovered. William Rich lived another 10 years after Vance's investigation, dying in 1907 at 62. He never married, never had children, and spent his final years in increasing isolation. Neighbors said he became obsessed with the sealed room, checking on it often, making sure it stayed closed, as if its continued concealment was the last, desperate act of loyalty to his father's twisted legacy. When he died, his will specified that the plantation house should be preserved exactly as it was, the sealed room left untouched, a silent monument to a forgotten sorrow. The will was honored for a few decades, but eventually the house fell into such disrepair that it became unsafe. The sealed room, the physical proof of Samuel Rich's existence, was eventually lost to time and weather, its contents crumbling to dust, its walls collapsing. The plantation itself changed hands several times in the decades after the Civil War. By the 1920s, it had been broken up and sold off piece by piece. The main house was finally torn down in the 1950s, its timbers salvaged, its bricks reused. The land was turned into farmland and small residential lots, wiping out the last physical traces of Willow Creek and its dark secret. The sealed room, the silent witness to Samuel's life, was destroyed, leaving only Vance's report and the fading memories of those who had seen it. But the story of Samuel Rich didn't die. It lived on in the archives, in the census records, in the memories of people who had known the family or heard the story passed down through generations. It became a kind of local legend, a cautionary tale about the danger of secrets, the cost of respectability, the way shame can poison a family for generations. It became a whisper in the wind, a shadow in the history of Muskogee County. What makes the story of Samuel Rich so unsettling isn't just the tragedy of his individual life, but what it reveals about official records and how history is built. The census, that most basic, seemingly objective document, had been manipulated to serve the purposes of a man who wanted to hide the truth. And because the census was an official document, because it carried the weight of government authority, the lie was accepted as truth for 40 years. That raises a disturbing question. How many other lies are buried in the historical record? How many other children, other people, other stories have been erased or falsified in the documents we rely on to understand the past? The census records are meant to be a complete and accurate count of the population, but they're only as accurate as the people filling them out. And if those people have reasons to lie, shame, fear, ambition, cruelty, then the records become something else entirely. They become a kind of official fiction, a story shaped by the powerful to serve their own ends. Vance's investigation had uncovered one such fiction, but it also raised the possibility that there might be others. In his report, he suggested that researchers should look closely at census records for oddities, children who appeared and then disappeared, ages that didn't match between censuses, names that changed or vanished. He suggested these oddities might not be clerical errors but deliberate falsifications, evidence of secrets hidden in plain sight within the official documents. Some historians took Vance's suggestion seriously and started looking for similar patterns in other census records. A few found them. There were cases of children who appeared in one census and disappeared in the next, families whose makeup shifted in ways that couldn't be easily explained, records that seemed to have been deliberately altered or faked. In some cases, researchers were able to uncover the stories behind the oddities. In others, the truth stayed buried, too deep in time and distance to be recovered. The story of Samuel Rich became a kind of pattern for understanding these hidden stories, a way to think about what might have happened when official records didn't match reality. It was a reminder that history isn't always what the documents say it is, that truth can be hidden in plain sight, and that secrets, no matter how carefully buried, can eventually be uncovered by someone patient and curious enough to look. But there's one part of Samuel Rich's story that remains unresolved, a mystery Vance was never able to solve and that has puzzled historians ever since. The question is simple, but its implications are deep. Why did Thomas Rich create the phantom child in the census records in the first place? If Thomas wanted to hide Samuel's existence, the most straightforward approach would have been to simply not list him in the census at all. The census taker, Josiah Crane, was a distant relative, and Thomas could easily have told him to ignore the child, to pretend he didn't exist. No one would have questioned it. Children died, children were born, families moved. An absence in the census wouldn't have raised any eyebrows. But instead, Thomas created a phantom child, a false Samuel who aged on paper while the real Samuel stayed hidden. Why? What was the point of such an elaborate lie? One possibility is that Thomas wanted to create a record of Samuel's existence without revealing the truth about him. By listing a phantom Samuel in the census, Thomas was acknowledging, in a way, that a child named Samuel existed. But by making the phantom Samuel 5 years older than the real Samuel, he created a barrier between them, a way of saying they were different people, that the phantom wasn't the same as the hidden child in the back room. Another possibility is that Thomas was trying to protect himself legally. If Samuel had been born to an enslaved woman, then the child would have been enslaved. But if Thomas could claim that Samuel was born in 1848, before the child's actual birth, he could argue that Samuel wasn't his child at all, but someone else's, someone who had since left the plantation or died. The phantom Samuel in the census could have been a kind of legal shield, a way to deflect responsibility for the real child. Or maybe the explanation is even simpler. Maybe Thomas was just trying to keep up the appearance of normalcy, to create a record that suggested everything was fine, that the family was intact and functioning as it should. The phantom Samuel was a way of saying, yes, I have a son named Samuel, and he's healthy and normal, and nothing is wrong. The lie wasn't meant to hide the truth so much as to reinforce the fiction Thomas had built for himself and for the world. Whatever the reason, the phantom Samuel stayed in the census records for 5 years, a ghost child who had never existed, who aged on paper while the real child stayed hidden. And when Thomas finally removed the phantom from the records in 1860, he created a mystery that wouldn't be solved for another 35 years, until a curious clerk named Henry Vance decided to look into a discrepancy in the census records and uncovered a story that had been carefully hidden away. The story of Samuel Rich is, in many ways, a story about the power of records and how official documents shape our understanding of the past. It's about how truth can be hidden in plain sight, how lies can be embedded in the very documents we rely on to understand history, and how one act of cruelty can echo through generations, affecting not just the victim but everyone connected to him. But it's also a story about the power of curiosity and persistence. Henry Vance, a clerk with no special authority or expertise, was able to uncover a secret that had been carefully hidden for 40 years simply by noticing something that didn't fit, by asking questions, by following the trail of evidence wherever it led. His investigation didn't change the past. Samuel Rich was still dead. The family was still broken. The shame was still there. But it did bring the truth into the light, and in doing so, it gave Samuel Rich a kind of dignity he never had in life. The story of Samuel Rich also raises questions about disability and how society has historically treated people with severe disabilities. In the 1850s, there was no support system for families with disabled children, no institutions dedicated to their care, no social acceptance of disability as a normal part of human variation. A child like Samuel, born with severe deformities, was seen as a tragedy, a shame, a problem to be hidden away. Thomas Rich's response, to hide his son and pretend he didn't exist, was cruel, but it wasn't unusual. Many families made similar choices, hiding disabled children away, denying their existence, treating them as if they weren't human. The story of Samuel Rich is a reminder of how far we've come in our understanding of disability and human dignity. But it's also a reminder of how much work remains to be done. Even today, in the 21st century, people with severe disabilities face discrimination, prejudice, and social exclusion. The story of Samuel Rich shows us what happens when that prejudice is taken to its extreme, when a child is denied not just acceptance, but existence itself. As we come to the end of this story, there are still questions left unanswered, mysteries the historical record can't fully resolve. What exactly were Samuel's deformities? Was he born to Margaret Rich or to an enslaved woman? Did he die in the early 1860s, or did he somehow survive and escape? Where was he buried? Is there a grave somewhere on the old plantation, an unmarked resting place no one has ever found? These questions may never be answered. The people who knew the truth are long dead. The plantation house is gone. The sealed room has been destroyed. The only evidence left is Henry Vance's report, filed away in the state archives, and the census records themselves, the phantom Samuel Rich, appearing in 1855 and disappearing in 1860. A ghost child who never existed, but who left a trace in the official documents. But maybe that's enough. Maybe the fact that we know Samuel Rich existed, that we know his story, that we know what happened to him, maybe that's enough to give him a kind of immortality. He was hidden in life, erased from the world, denied existence by his own father. But in death, through the work of a curious clerk and the chance reorganization of documents, he has been brought back into the light. His story has been told. His existence has been acknowledged. His suffering has been witnessed. The phantom child who appeared in the records before he was born has finally been given a name, a story, and a place in history. And maybe that's the only justice that can be offered to a child who was denied justice in life. The discovery of Samuel Rich's story in the census records reminds us that history isn't always what the documents say it is. It reminds us that truth can be hidden in plain sight, that official records can be manipulated, and that secrets, no matter how carefully buried, can eventually be uncovered by someone patient and curious enough to look. It also reminds us of the importance of asking questions, of noticing when something doesn't fit, of following the trail of evidence wherever it leads. Henry Vance wasn't a detective, wasn't a historian, wasn't someone with any special authority to look into private family matters. He was just a clerk who noticed something odd in the census records and decided to look into it. And in doing so, he uncovered a story that had been hidden for 40 years. The Rich family's secret is now part of the historical record. The phantom child who appeared in the census before he was born has been explained, and in being explained, has been given a kind of dignity he never had in life. The sealed room where Samuel was hidden has been documented, and the marks on the walls, those hundreds of scratches that might have been an attempt to count the days, have been witnessed and recorded. But the story of Samuel Rich isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a story about the price of secrets, about how shame can poison a family for generations, about the cruelty that can hide behind a mask of respectability. It's a story that challenges us to think about what we hide, what we deny, what we're willing to erase to keep up the appearance of normalcy. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets hidden in the archives, still mysteries waiting to be uncovered? Leave your comment below and tell me what you think happened to Samuel Rich, whether you believe he died on the plantation or if you think he somehow escaped and lived out his life in obscurity. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like it, stories of mysteries hidden in plain sight, of secrets buried in the historical record, of truths that have been carefully hidden away, subscribe to the Fear Sermon. Hit the notification bell and share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries and historical enigmas. See you in the next video.